title of this morning's message is Gospel Logic, Wrath Revealed, Grace Given. And the reason the title begins with the words gospel logic is because Paul was a very logical thinker. And as you work your way through this letter, you see that. And I've been trying to highlight that, not to be overly technical, but just that you'd see and appreciate what he's conveying here through the tools of language. And I want you to see and be reminded of how we've been hearing this, learning of this gospel logic. And we're going to read, starting in verse 15. We're going to back up a little bit. Our main text is going to again be verse 18 and following, but start at verse 15. Paul says, "For my part, I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome." And notice where he goes next. You see this word "for" over and over again. And as you see the word "for" in most of your translations, you probably see that word. Some of them may not have it, but it's there in the original. It's Paul digging down deeper and deeper into the logic of his understanding of the gospel and why it is that he's eager to present that to us. So he says, verse 16, "For," why is he eager to preach the gospel to the Romans, to us today? "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." And why is he not ashamed of the gospel? "For it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." Why is it the power of God for salvation? Or how is it the power of God for salvation? Verse 17, "For in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith." And we've been talking about how this points to Christ, that God reveals himself to us. And that is really what our salvation amounts to, is us seeing God. Seeing who he really is, not who our distorted minds tend to think he is, not how we mischaracterize him, but seeing who he really is. He reveals himself to us, specifically through the gospel. And we're going to see this morning as he goes along here in Romans 1, he also mentions the common grace of creation itself. God is revealing himself to mankind. He has been since the beginning. And we're going to talk about exactly what that means. But there's this logic to what Paul is communicating. And then from there, and within this logic or through this logic, he also talks about this idea of wrath. And we talked about wrath last week quite a bit, but I want to say more about it. There's certain things I left unsaid, and I want to be as clear as possible. And I think this is really important because when we think about wrath, we have certain images that come to mind, and I've used this example before, but you can think of an angry boss, or you can think of the one I think we've referred to over and over as like an angry father, an abusive father. You think of someone who's wrathful, you tend to picture a red face and someone who is lashing out, maybe verbally, maybe physically. We think of human wrath, we think of it in terms of punishing someone and inflicting pain upon someone for how they've offended us. That's how we tend to think of wrath. That's the concept. And so as we hear here of God's wrath, we can project or impose upon God the way we humans experience wrath and the way we humans express wrath. And we can think that is basically capturing the essence of God's wrath. And I don't think that's the case. I think what Paul is conveying here and what he's illustrating here paints a different picture of God's wrath that is more consistent with God's character. It's the truthful or righteous expression of wrath, and it's not like the human destructive form of wrath that we tend to think of and that we tend to experience. And I looked throughout Scripture, I went kind of chasing down that word in the Old Testament and to see examples of it. And you see it used with regard to humans. You see it in the Old Testament when, remember the story of Jacob and Esau, and it says there that Esau wanted to kill his brother Jacob, and it refers to his feelings about Jacob as wrathful or angry. Similarly, in the story of Joseph, when remember Potiphar, his wife, she lies to him and tells him that Joseph had come on to her, when in reality he did not. She lied, and Potiphar was filled with anger toward Joseph, thinking at that time that was true. He was angry. And there are many, many other examples of where humans are angry or wrathful toward one another. And that is more in line with that typical way we think of wrath, when it's human to human. Well, then you see, I should say this before I get to when you see it with regard to God toward humans. Let me just say, so that's Old Testament examples. the Esau example, the Potiphar example, others we could look at. Then you go to the New Testament, and it's pretty clear in the New Testament that wrath is something that when humans experience it, it does not produce any kind of righteous outcome. So James 1 verse 20 says, the wrath of man does not work the righteousness of God. So there's something different about human wrath versus God's wrath. And almost always in the New Testament, whenever this term is used to speak of man's wrath, it's saying that this is something that is inappropriate. This is something that is to be put off. This is something that is to be avoided. It's not something God is somehow endorsing or condoning in any way. It is a perversion. It is one of our human perversions, how we experience wrath and how we express wrath. But backing up again to this other category, this godly form of wrath, going back to the Old Testament now, you do see God experiencing wrath, and unlike human wrath, it is not perverse in any way. It is fully in keeping with God's love and mercy and grace and justice. It is not in any contradictory way set opposed to those realities. It's consistent, and so it's God. As we said last week, and I'll say it again, I think it's this idea that God is fiercely opposed to that which opposes Him. It is God's response to our response to Him. And we'll see that more clearly in this text of Romans 1 this morning. But let me just give you some examples from the Old Testament to fill this out even more. Remember when Moses was called by God to go to Pharaoh, and he says, hey, I can't speak, I'm not eloquent, you got the wrong man for this job, and God, it says, was angry with Moses. And you know, he was not rip-roaring mad with Moses, but there was an opposition to Moses' rejection of all that God had already done to prove Himself to Moses. And so it says that God was angry with Moses in kind of a disciplinary type way. And it says, fine, we'll get Aaron and he'll be the spokesman. You see it in the Old Testament with regard to the Egyptians when the Israelites were delivered from Egypt, and God caused the Red Sea to come upon the Egyptian army. It says that in God's wrath, He extinguished the Egyptians. You see it toward Israel when they're wandering in the wilderness, and God has provided for them over and over and over again, and yet they failed to appreciate or trust in His provisions, and they kept saying, if we could only go back to Egypt, if we could only go back there, we would be really secure, we'd really have it good. I remember they talk about we had better food back there and all these other things, and it says there that God was angry with Israel. It's often coupled with this idea of a consuming fire and kind of putting an end to something or someone. It can be related to God's discipline, and so it can be involved in that disciplinary father-to-child type of way. And there is a ferocity to it, but not in the same human, unhinged, temper tantrum-esque, flying off the handle kind of way that we humans tend to think of it, picture it, experience it. Not at all. In this context of Romans will help us, I think, appreciate even more what it's like and how it's this opposition within God as He observes what we humans do to Him, to ourselves, to one another. I think in a very real sense, anger always is kind of responsive. I think we can say with accuracy it's always responsive in nature. It's God's response to our response to Him. Let's read verses 18 through 23. Continuing the logic here. Again, beginning with the word for, at least in my translation, it says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power, His divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. This is God being being true to himself. The New Testament says that God cannot lie. The New Testament says that God cannot deny himself. And being true to himself in the revelation of his righteousness, there's also this revelation of his wrath. Being true to himself, he cannot do other than oppose that which opposes him and that which invites destruction into our lives and the lives of others. And aren't you thankful that he does, that he cares about all these perversions and distortions and all the havoc that is wreaked in this world and has been from the beginning? God is not somehow calloused to all of that. He doesn't ignore it. He's not unconcerned about it. He absolutely cares about it, and he cares to put an end to it ultimately. And even within that, there is this great patience as he allows us to go our own way for a time. So you have these ideas that are all kind of blended together here, and I want to talk more about this logic of the wrath of God and how he explains it that we just read. I want to go into some explanation of that. But before we do that, I want to just remind you, and I think I said this last week as well, and I'll probably continue to say it because I think it's helpful. If you want to know the details concerning, let's say, the human body, you would have to go to an expert. You'd have to go to someone who's studied long and hard on the topic of human biology or human physiology. And you would hear them describe things with great technical accuracy and probably terminology you'd learn, all to become more familiar with the human body and what makes it work. It's very detailed. You think even today there's all this development in terms of study of microbiology and DNA, all these things that we know now that for many, many thousands of years we weren't aware of. How sophisticated the human body is and how God designed it and created it. You would have to go to someone who's an expert in that field, right? To learn of the human body, to really understand it. Even though day to day we live in our bodies and we don't think about all those scientific realities that are operative in our bodies every day. Similarly, if you wanted to learn how a automobile works, you would turn to an automotive engineer or a mechanic, and they would explain to you in great detail how that engine runs or how the vehicle is propelled. Those types of details. Someone could break that down for you and inform you as to what's going on there. Even though, like with our bodies, we drive our cars almost every day and don't think about all those mechanical, technical things that are playing out. Similarly here, what Paul, through divine inspiration, is revealing to us is what makes people tick in terms of the human soul, the human heart. He gives us a window into it with great detail, and that's why we're not going to rush through this. We're going to allow God to teach us in this passage, and that's what Paul's doing through the technical use of the tools of language in this letter. He is helping us see, grasp, understand what makes people tick. And it's all related to this revealing of wrath. It starts to make sense as we see what God is reacting to within man, within people who have always lived in this world, every human being other than Jesus and ourselves included. So it's all in this context. So let's just talk about where he begins here, verse 18. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against, first of all ungodliness. And then stop there for a second. This is really important. If you were in men's meeting, we talked about this at length. When you hear the word ungodliness, which is used in almost every English translation I could find, how do you hear or understand that word? And that's a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer it out loud, but I just want you to think of ungodliness. I mean, it has the word God in it, in that English term. And what you probably tend to think, if you're like me, you hear that and you tend to think of, well, not like God, ungodlike. Someone said in men's meeting, well, it makes me think of an atheist or someone who denies God's existence. We think in terms of behavior, maybe immoral conduct. So conduct that isn't consistent with how God would act. We think in those terms. But if you do a little bit of a deep dive on what is that actual word in the original, the term God is not there in the original. This is a traditional translation that's been passed on I'm not exactly sure why. They have their reasons for making these choices, but I think we can maybe misconstrue the idea here if we don't go into what the real word, the root word actually means, which is this. It has to do with reverence, worship. It's the same root that occurs later where it says that people worship and serve the creature more than the creator. Doesn't that idea of, let's say, irreverence paint a different picture than just ungodliness in that superficial behavioral sort of way we tend to think of? This is from the heart, not just on the outside, but from the heart, what humans do with the revelation of God's righteousness. We don't revere him. Naturally speaking, we're not compelled. We don't attribute to God the worth he deserves to be attributed to him. You hear the word worship, and that's from two words in terms of the evolution of that word. Worth is part of where that word comes from. We don't attribute the worth to God that he deserves. This wrath of God is revealed, and it's upon, literally it's upon, not men in particular themselves per se, but something from within me, something that's happening within God's creatures. And it's this, it's the failure of humankind from the beginning to actually see and appreciate and value God the way he deserves to be valued. It's revealed against this irreverence, this non-worshipfulness, and along with that, unrighteousness, the opposite of God's righteousness, or to divorce it from some of the baggage, just to make it really plain, God is right. He is always right in every conceivable way, in his thinking, in his plans, and how he treats his creatures. We see that, of course, in living color in the life of Jesus. He is right, and we are not. With the opposite of that, unrighteousness. And from there he says, what do people do with that unrighteousness? How does that play out? Well, it's a suppression of the truth. We suppress what is true of God. We hold it down and we go our own way, and we trust implicitly in our own understanding or our own rightness. And then he's going to go on to say more about that, putting it in the context of creation. How is it that this is the case, that we suppress the truth in unrighteousness? Well, he's going to give this example with reference to creation. He says in verse 19, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. And here's more of that logic. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. We might want to give an excuse, and literally it's the word defense. We might want to defend ourselves. Well, God, you didn't do enough for me to revere you. You didn't do enough for me to accept your righteousness. And he's saying, no, that's actually on you. I've made it clear. I've made it evident. And you could say to yourself, and I could say to myself in honesty, hey, it doesn't feel like that's the case. There are many times where it doesn't feel like God has done enough. And that's my opinion. And it's a very exalted opinion in my own mind, but it is my opinion, and God here is disagreeing with me for my own good. And he often disagrees with us for our own good. Just like a father who loves his child and says, I know you think this is the way it is, but in actuality, it's not that way. It's this way. And all of us parents can appreciate that. He says, he's made it evident. Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, they're clearly seen, understood. All this language that has to do with us, wait, there are things we know. We know God himself. It's true. His power, his divine nature. And then there's something that we do with that. But before we go there, let me see, Jeff, do you have queued up? I have this video I want to show you. It's not long. We're going to try this if technology doesn't fail us. It's all this amazing footage. If you ever watched it, any of you who's seen the Planet Earth series years ago, BBC, do you remember that? High-def cameras they use, and they get all this amazing footage of all these different creatures of all kinds, and even weather systems, and just all the beauty of Earth. And I wanted to show you that because I wanted you to appreciate how God puts this in the context of creation. And if you think of from the very beginning, when Adam and Eve were created and all that God made, I mean, it's spectacular. Life itself is a miracle. And then all these different life forms, from really big whales and lions and tigers and things like that to tiny microscopic plankton in the ocean. And then you think the earth itself is amazing. There's another great, worth watching. I think it's a documentary. It's called The Privileged Planet. It just has to do with the fine tuning of how statistically unlikely it is that a planet could exist that's habitable, that has all the conditions met for humans and animals and creatures to live in and to thrive in, and how kind of absurd it would be to believe that just happened without some kind of intelligence behind it. So it's this fine-tuning idea, and you can appreciate the world we live in, that we all experience every day. There is a generous God behind all of this, who made all of this, who's, as it says back in the Old Testament in Psalm 19, the heavens are declaring the glory of God. It shows his handiwork. And from Adam and Eve till now, there has been this human, I want to say proclivity, but even more than that, a constant, natural diminishing of the worth of the one who did all this, who made it all. And as he goes on to explain here, when we do that, and God's given us over to that, okay, so you do that. Given over to all the things he says in terms of exchanging the truth of God for a lie, choosing our own wisdom over God's wisdom, which amounts to folly, worshiping and serving the creature more than the creator. He gives us over, and then there's all this perversion and destruction and pain and death. And here is a God who generously gave for us to be able to experience this life. We should be amazed. Years ago, this is just off the cuff, so I'll probably butcher this, but years ago there was a comedian I heard talking about how amazing it is that we fail to be amazed by life itself, the amazing things we have. And he gave the example even of technology and what we're able to do. The example of sitting in a plane. He was talking about sitting in a plane, typing on his laptop, using the Wi-Fi, and it went down temporarily. And how angry he was and how agitated he was because the Wi-Fi went down. And he realized how insane that was. How ludicrous. He's like, I'm sitting in a chair, flying through the air, eating a little bag of peanuts and drinking soda and typing on my laptop that's itself amazing, using Wi-Fi, and I'm not blown away by all these things. Something about our ability to, in our own ignorance or our own dullness, to fail to see and appreciate all that we have, that is all a gift, doesn't come from nowhere. There's someone who gave it. And so now as you think about wrath, think about God's opposition to that which opposes him. That which is from within us opposes him and minimizes his worth and perverts and distorts and destroys everything of this amazing planet. I wish you could have seen that video. It's really good. Even as he shows these vivid images, it's the old voice of David Attenborough. Remember that guy's voice? It's an awesome voice he has. That's why they picked him, I'm sure. But he's just talking about how it's virtually perfect. And Adam and Eve, I mean, they experienced it prior to the curse. It's still amazing after the curse. And they experienced it before the curse. I was like, nah. And they get, oh yeah, these things are great. They could even value the things that are made, but just don't make the connection, the obvious connection. Where did all this come from? This is human ingratitude, and it's natural to us. And Paul, as he talks about wrath, he talks about it in this context of this gift of creation and what we naturally do with it. Later in Romans, he'll talk about the law and how the law too exposes this fallen condition. It doesn't explain everything, but it gives these symptoms of our human problem. It reveals our need for Christ and our need for the gospel. It shows that in our humanness, we would never go looking for our Creator. We wouldn't do it. From the garden forward, that's what you see with mankind. We don't go looking for Him. In Isaiah this morning, in Isaiah 30, there's this neat imagery there where it's talking about how we try to build alliances. The Israelites, they want to go back to Egypt, and they want to, if we can build this sort of alliance with Egypt, they can help protect us, or another people group, or if that doesn't work, then we'll get on horses and we'll just run away. And it says there that God basically, out of love for them, consistent with His love for them, He allows them to go down that path for a time, and they end up in this place, and it says, it's a little bit strange, but it says like a flagpole on a mountaintop or a signal on a high hill. And like, what does that mean? Here's what it means. If you're trying to run from a threat of some kind, you don't want to be a flagpole sticking up on top of a mountain by yourself. You don't want to be sending the signal, hey, here I am, come get me. But yet it says like God in His orchestration of things, in His love for His creatures, and the simultaneous revelation of His wrath, His opposition to that which destroys us and destroys others, He actually causes us to end up in this place where we're completely alone and vulnerable and exposed, and we have no other choice. We're out of options. And that's when He says in the next verse there in Isaiah 30 is, therefore I long to have compassion on you. I've eliminated all other escape routes so that you would finally see your need for me. And then when I reveal my glory through the person and work of Jesus coming to meet you at the place of your deepest darkness and misery, then you will see and you'll behold your God and you'll be amazed by my provisions for you, that I've always been the only one you can count on. There's a friend of mine who likes to say, when life is difficult and you sense that there's really nowhere to turn but God, and he says, gosh, has it really come to this? This is the worst. I mean, did it really come down to this where my only option is to trust God? I mean, so we can laugh about that because it's funny. And it's true. We would do anything in our power to keep from ever getting to that place, right? And part of what God is saying here is, you're a creature, you're small, you're fragile, you're limited. I created you, I sustain you, I've given you everything, I'm generous, I'm your Father, and you won't turn to me naturally. And the good news is I'm not giving up on you. I'm coming for you. I'm going to reveal myself to you. Even in the turning over to all the miserable stuff that is described throughout the rest of Romans 1, even in turning over to all that, you have later this idea that it's the kindness of God that leads us to repentance. God turns us back toward himself. That place you end up, and I know you end up there, I end up there too. I don't know exactly what it feels like for you. It's different for all of us because we're all a little different. But we can all end up in that place where it is kind of like, oh, has it really come to this? I'm really alone. I'm isolated. I'm by myself. I'm vulnerable. I'm exposed. And then there's all this miserable, ugly stuff. As I said, you do everything in your power to not end up there, but you ended up there. And by design, God has you there. And he meets you there. And he offers you himself there. And he says, I meet you where no one else can meet you. I provide a security for you no one else can provide. I provide a food and a water, living bread and living water that no one else can provide. It says a few other things, and then I'll go back to that idea of grace, because that's what we're going to finish on, is this grace given. But the language, as I said, we'll spend more time. We'll look at these in more detail. But Notice from verse 21 to verse 23, phrase by phrase here, even though they knew God, didn't honor him as God or give thanks. I described that. Didn't attribute to God the worth he deserves. In our appraisal of God, he's not as valuable as he really is. Weren't thankful, weren't satisfied with the gifts given. Futile in speculations, foolish heart darkened. Professing to be wise, became fools. Exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, of birds, four-footed animals, crawling creatures. This is another interesting observation. The language there, if you look back at the Greek translation of the Old Testament, these same terms for man, birds, four-footed animals, crawling creatures are all used in the Genesis account as the big word taxonomy, these categories, these different species that Paul's just in a summarized way, just referring to those and saying, we made more of those than the one who made them, than the brilliant mind who designed and engineered them, than the generous heart that granted them. And from there it'll say God gave them over. But jumping ahead to this idea of grace given, which once again is consistent with wrath revealed, not in contradiction to it. It says in verse 21 through 26 of Romans 3, but now apart from the law, as I said earlier, the law reveals certain things about God's character, reveals certain things about us and our need, the symptoms of our root problem. He says, but now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, pointed to in every way in the Old Testament. Even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus, or the righteousness of God through could be the faithfulness of Jesus for all who believe. For there's no distinction. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, being justified as a gift by his grace through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus, whom God displayed publicly, and we said is all this manifestation of God through creation. He keeps showing himself, and through Jesus most brilliantly and clearly shows himself. He displayed himself publicly as a propitiation in his blood through faith. This was to demonstrate his righteousness, because in the forbearance of God, he passed over the sins previously committed. For the demonstration, I say, of his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be both just, calling human sin and rebellion what it is, opposing it as it is, and also the justifier, the one who covers, the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And another translation of that could be the one who lives because of the faithfulness of Jesus, that Christ for us is the provision of God. So Romans 1 describes all of us. Most importantly, it describes us, and I can't think of anything more important than understanding ourselves, our kids, the world we live in, the people, and I guess one thing that would be more important is understanding God, and that's where he continues to go, is saying, hey, this is the human condition, this is God. This is the human condition, this is God. And so I hope you're in learning and being helped by what you're hearing. And I want to end with this question, which we'll continue to answer as we move along in Romans, which will highlight this glory of our great Creator God and help us become further and more deeply acquainted with who He is. But we'll end with this question. We talked about this in men's meeting. This is really important. And if you heard nothing else, just kind of chew on this, okay? When God saves us from wrath, and we know places in the New Testament that says that, when He saves us from wrath by His grace, what is He saving us from? Steve just gave it away. It's fine. I mean, we can think of it in other ways, right? Because we can think of it, here's the way I used to think of it, is He's saving us from that which He wants to do to us. And maybe, perhaps, there's truth to that. We'd have to be really precise in how we try to explain that. But think of what Steve just said. What if one of the key ways and the most clear ways of understanding God's wrath and the heart of God consistent within himself, what if one of the most clear ways of understanding is to realize that he is saving us from ourselves, that he is saving us from that which we by nature do to ourselves and do to others. Everything that's described in detail in Romans chapter 1. What if he is saving us from ourselves? It is his opposition to that which opposes him. It is his response to our response to him. Do you see that? And it is not unloving for God to oppose us. It is loving for him to oppose us. It's even loving for him to be determined at some point in time to put an end to rebellion and destruction and devastation and death. Right? So we'll continue to think through this as we go along, and I hope it's encouraging to you. I hope you're pointed to Christ and the greatness of the gospel in a way that refreshes you and builds both your discernment, your understanding, and your appreciation. That's what it's doing for me. So let's close in prayer, okay? Father, thank you for the study we've had this morning, some of the details that we've considered as you are teaching us. You're our teacher, and you're teaching us. You're illuminating our mind. Because things about you are clearly seen, but we, even in seeing them, we distort, we pervert, we twist, we minimize, we fail to appreciate, we fail to revere and worship. We're unthankful by nature. We're never satisfied. We're a tremendous, it's an understatement to say we're a tremendous threat to our own selves and to others in that fallenness, in that foolishness. And you love us. You created us. We're part of your good creation, fearfully and wonderfully made. We get to exist. And we get to exist in this world of abundant provision. And we're amazed. And you pursue us so passionately and so fervently that you willingly sent your Son into this world to suffer, to be the victim of the affliction of man. In a very real sense, to reveal your righteousness and to reveal your opposition to our unrighteousness, and to make full provision for us. And God, the places that we end up in our hearts and our minds when we feel like we're struggling and striving and trying to fight and claw our way through life and protect ourselves, protect our interests, and condemn and fight with other people around us, the struggle to survive that we're in, that even the animal kingdom is in, the struggle to survive, would you help us remember when we find ourselves plagued by our fallenness, enslaved to our own anger, enslaved to our own lust, enslaved to our own greed, enslaved to our own hatred, enslaved to our own fear. Would you help us to remember your provisions for us, who you are, what you're like. Help us to trust you. Help us to consider Christ crucified for us, to believe that everything, absolutely everything we need in Christ we have. Help us to believe that. And we thank you for what you'll do and pray that you would, as we move forward, sharpen our minds, help us to understand, help us to think clearly, that we would know the truth and the truth would set us free. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.